Okay. Are the lights okay now, or do people want them brighter? It looks like we are okay. So we should get started. A very warm welcome, everyone, including those joining us online this afternoon. This is the 10th annual Classics in English lecture. It is with great pleasure I introduce this year's speaker, Katerina Stergiopoulou, is lecturer in modern Greek at the University of Edinburgh. Before joining Edinburgh, just under a year ago, she was assistant professor of classics and Hellenic studies at Princeton University. And before that, assistant professor of literature at Claremont McKenna College. Katerina trained as a comparatist. Much of her work focuses on questions of translation and especially on the many afterlives of Greek antiquity in 20th century literature and thought. She has written on a number of topics related to ancient Greek literature in modernity. She has written on the Greek poet George Seferis. She has written on Carl Schmitt and philology, on the American poet George Oppen. Her first book came out with Cambridge University Press last year, entitled Modernist Hellenism, Pound, Eliot, H.D. and the Translation of Greece. And it traces the intersection of modernism and Hellenism in the development of Anglo-American poetry in the first half of the 20th century. She is currently working on a number of things, but I will mention two major projects that she's involved in. One of them, a book on the Greek poet Kavafi and his citation practices, placing them at the intersection of modern Greek literature, classical receptions, comparative modernisms, and translation. And her other big project at the moment is an edited volume that she has been one of the driving forces behind it, Brill's Companion to the Ancient and Modern Reception of Sappho. And she will be contributing to that volume a chapter on Sappho in American women poets of the second half of the 20th century. The title of her talk today is Tilted Gazing, American Women Writers and the Tenuousness of Classics. Katerina, once again, a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Valerie, for this very kind introduction and for this invitation. It's really a delight to be here. This is my first time at Oxford, so I'm very, very excited and honored to have been asked to give this lecture, especially after all of the many amazing people who preceded me in giving this lecture. Thank you all for coming, both in person and on Zoom. So I'll get started, and as you may gather, this really comes out of my work for that Sappho volume. All right, and let me know if you can't hear me. As Emily Hauser has recently argued in the ancient Greek context, becoming a poet activates gender categories. When thinking about classicism and gender, Sappho inevitably is at the forefront, not only as the first female lyric poet, but also because of her putative sexuality. As Amy Sarah Carroll writes, quote, lesbianism and poetry within a Western imaginary have been scanned as nearly but not quite synonymous, end quote. Sappho, as I'm sure you all know, offers a model for women's creative activity, obviously in antiquity already, but already to somebody like Christine de Pizan in the 15th century. And many studies have traced her significance in this respect. There we are. Here, for example, is Susan Gubar's articulation of this paradigm with kind of several connected Sappho paradigms in her seminal 1984 essay, sophistries, and I've highlighted the bits that I'm gonna read. Gubar writes that Sappho represents all of the lost women of genius in literary history, so that's one paradigm, and is a very special kind of precursor, and also allows the modern woman poet to write for or as Sappho because of the state of her work. She's in need of a contemporary collaborator. Even if there's ambivalence about the kind of example that Sappho offers, women writers tend to feel that the possibility of a connection to her across so many centuries, of claiming her as an ancestor, is generally valuable. Imagist poet Amy Lowell exemplifies this in her poem The Sisters, where Lowell brings in Sappho as a character. But the poem, as you see, if you can scan it quickly, the blue bits, the poem ends up unsure as to whether the female predecessors, including Sappho in this poem, constrict or liberate. I cannot write like you, she says near the end. Yet, while recognizing the difficulty and pressure of having older sisters, Lowell also celebrates that we are one family of women who write poetry. And she looks to function as just such an older sister to some other woman with an itch for writing at the end of the poem. So Selby Wynne Schwartz's 2021 novel, After Sappho, imaginatively explores the temporal play that Sappho allows, both reaching into the past and promising a future. She does this both through her own writing of this novel, but also in the real life turn of the 20th century women artists who are her protagonists. We who had come after Sappho would now go onwards. Now Sappho was going to become us. We were going to happen to Sappho. Again, despite tensions and ambivalences, the novel still joyfully portrays a community of women artists created through devotion to Sappho. As the 20th century unfolds and women's movements make strides, Sappho gains an even greater symbolic stature, perhaps less the poet and more as the first lesbian. It is in this context, then, which I've very, very briefly sketched, of Sappho as a touchstone for women's writing, and as different from the classical tradition writ large, that I want to draw attention to the surprising absence of sustained engagement with Sappho as a signifier or symbol from three preeminent women poets' work. And here are our protagonists for the day. Sylvia Plath, Adrienne Rich, both belonging to roughly the same post-war American poetry generation, and Harryette Mullen, who's still writing a generation later. This absence of Sappho is written and signifies differently in each case. Plath names a very unsapphic late poem, Lesbos. Rich's also late poem, Hubble Photographs After Sappho, offers a transposition of Sappho's Fragment 16. Mullen's 1995 book-length poem, Muse and Drudge, includes Sappho as one of its voices in what she calls a chorus of women, but doesn't name her, even as several Sapphic fragments surface throughout the volume's quatrains. I see my approach in this talk as interacting productively with recent trends in the study of classical reception. And here are only a couple of examples. The focus on weak links, as in Michelle Zerba's book, Modern Odysseys, The Poetics of Indirection, or oblique classicisms, as seen in the work of Lara Jansen. As Jansen has argued, and I quote, there exist multiple narratives of the classical tradition that disclose the flip side of its sense of presence, that of its existence on various levels of abstraction, dispersal, silence, and occlusion, end quote. I hope to probe today the way in which certain resistances to classics or tangential or incidental uses can still function meaningfully or meaninglessly, illuminating the place of classical texts or myths in the contemporary world, as well as the ancient materials themselves. And in the interest of time and kind of cohesion, I will be focusing on Sappho today, but I'd be happy to talk about further examples, which I cut from this talk in questions, if you'd like. Plath and Rich both seem ambivalent towards Sappho, and they seem to perceive as too intertwined with a male-coded classical tradition and establishment, and perhaps also too closely associated with the previous generation of female writers. Mullen is more interested in interrogating the role that Sappho has been made to play in that kind of establishment, and in using her as one woman artist among many to think about the dual and equally limiting positions of women as muses or drudges, and about women's almost always negatively coded ties to the body. In all three cases, as we will see, Sappho's tenuous appearance is a pointer to some larger issue, for the exploration of which she herself, or the specifics of her work, seem almost incidental. So I'll start with Plath. All right. Despite being a voracious reader and student of the classical tradition, Plath has nonetheless surprisingly little to say about Sappho. As she's coming into her own as a poet, Sappho appears in her diary as the first in a list of female poets that, as is typical for such lists, jumps from the 7th century BC to the 19th century. So Plath is writing and then meditating on her own poetry, and she asks, I quote, who rivals, right? Who rivals me, Sylvia Plath? Well, in history, Sappho, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Christina Rossetti, Amy Lowell, Emily Dickinson, Edna St. Vincent Millay, all dead, end quote. Sappho reappears near the end of Plath's short life, when in late October 1962, shortly after the writing of this poem that I'll be talking about, Plath asks her friend Clarissa Roche, the wife of a classicist, to bring her any Sappho you've got in translation. I must read her, a fellow lady poet, end quote. The implication that she has not yet read any Sappho should be taken with a grain of salt, as Holly Ranger has shown. Plath often downplayed her own learning and may well have been performing a role to her correspondent. There is no record of Sappho in Plath's library, however, and other than the ambivalent testimony of Lesbos, barely a trace of Sappho in her poems. And again, this is in sharp contrast to Plath's consistent flirting with, say, Greek tragedy or other mythical figures. As calculated as her distance from Sappho the poet may have been, however, Sappho was a constant part of Plath's life and then letters between 1959 and 61. For Sappho was the name of the kitten which she and Ted Hughes adopted, a kitten who figures in those letters constantly. I'm not just saying that random, it will come back. Plath did, however, own a copy of Longinus, in whose on the Sublime, on sublimity, fragment 31 is preserved. The Longinus offers an extensive commentary on Sappho's poetics, as you all know, but what's striking if you think about it in the Plath context is that he may well have been speaking about Plath. She's adept at selecting and combining the most important and excessive concomitants, irrational and sane at once, not one single emotion, but a concourse of emotions. That could very well be describing Plath's own poetry. Lesbos, the poem that I'll be talking about today, certainly relies on violent or unexpected oppositions. Famously, in its opening line, viciousness in the kitchen. Plath's speaker, initial address to her ostensible friend whom she visits, at the end here, and I love, I'm a pathological liar, reads as a jumbling of the components of Longinus' description of Sappho's passions of love. Mania itself, which is not part of this description here, will appear at the end of the poem too. Indeed, one could see Lesbos as harboring a specific inversion of fragment 31 at its center, one which literally redirects lesbian eros. Plath's consistent splitting of femininity and female roles between conservative domesticity and iconoclastic rebellion is at the center of her Lesbos. The poem taps into Plath's uncertainty as to what a female bond may be, presenting both a lesbian fantasy and a reality of domestic competition. Her private writings, as well as her novel The Bell Jar, suggest an ambivalence towards communities of women and towards lesbianism. They are perceived as at once a potential source of comfort and tenderness, such as that Plath gets from and gives to the cat Sappho, and as a threat to an ideal model of femininity that's tied to fertility that Plath remains attached to. The poem's irony is often noted, but what it ironizes, I will argue, as I move through it today, is a series of specific visions of Lesbos and thus of Sappho that were in the air in the mid-20th century. Certainly, this Lesbos, as you can already see from the opening few lines, is not the idyllic world created by the women writers and artists Natalie Barney's Paris Salon at the turn of the 20th century, the so-called Sappho 1900 that Schwartz's novel focuses on. Nor is it even the more sanguine version of this kind of female society that Virginia Woolf envisages in her short story, A Society. Plath's Lesbos is an enclosed, windowless, claustrophobic space that is, however, similarly marked as feminine in 1950s ideology, right? The kitchen. Plath gestures towards the idea of Lesbos as imaginary or artificial by designating her neighbor's kitchen as all Hollywood, and as we saw already, calls herself a liar, mentions her neighbor's acting in the stage curtains, and so on. Lesbos, moreover, quotes the woman whom the speaker visits as sapphic in multiple ways. She has blown your tubes and seems to embrace a masculine identity or masculine superiority in contrast to her thoroughly emasculated husband. She tries to preach a modeled female solidarity predicated on the opposition to reproduction. Drown the kittens, drown the daughter, Plath's daughter, or the speaker's daughter. This is at the very least a callback to the other famous poem by the title of Lesbos, a poem by Baudelaire, a poet whom Plath loved. That poem equally emphasizes the sterile passions of Sappho's island and Sappho's own maleness. And if you manage to read through the Amy Lowell poem, you will see that Lowell too calls a Sappho the sapphic pursuit a male pursuit. In exchange for her daughter's sick kittens, and indeed for the daughter herself, this antagonist in the poem offers the speaker an escape of tiger pants and a kind of siren femme fatale role. You could eat him, he's a boy, sit on a rock off Cornwall, and so on. She also suggests that the two women might form a small female community, perhaps like Natalie Barney's salon, and meet in another life, me and you. Later on in the poem, the speaker herself reminisces about that night that they shared when the moon dragged its blood-bagged sick animal. The moon here is as sick as the daughter's sick kittens mentioned earlier, and shares a color with Sappho's rosy-fingered moon, a color that, of course, not its evocative beauty from Fragment 96. The women in this vignette worked the Sand's body in a quasi-erotic scene that suggests more than it states. And again, this is something that Sappho does a lot. This is the most explicit that Sappho gets, for example, in Fragment 94. Hard as this antagonist may try to enfold the speaker in female solidarity, both in the present, but also in an idealized future and a remembered past, the speaker nonetheless forcefully rebuffs her endeavors. And here is where Fragment 31 comes in. As you all know, I'm sure, Sappho's speaker in Fragment 31 is envious of the man who calmly listens to the beautiful woman whom she desires, as she herself, the speaker, experiences a sequence of body-shattering physical symptoms that bring her to the brink of death. Here, though, as soon as Plath's speaker stops to look at her interlocutor, at our heads, our bones, our hair, as soon as she remembers that once you were beautiful, she's grateful for the appearance of the woman's husband. This is how the stanza continues, who, though impotent, he's definitely not a sapphic peer of the gods, can still absorb what she calls the lightning, the acid baths, the skyfalls off of you, the corroding rather than enchanting ways the woman emits. This neighbor is the opposite of Sappho's woman, who, with sweet voice and the lovely laughter. Indeed, we have a sonic display of the effect of her harsh and insistent speech at the very end of this second stanza on the right. Note the blitz of S's and K's in the sparks are blue, the blue sparks spill, splitting like quartz into a million bits. Like Sappho's speaker, Plath feels attacked by the woman. Unlike hers, the attack is perceived as intentional and hateful, and the male buffer is desired. I try to keep him in, rather than envied. Even in the speaker's memory of that night that we were just looking at, that less hateful occasion when a woman's quartz had not yet split and could still be addressed romantically as "oh jewel," "oh valuable," the speaker here too seems close to dying, and it is again the husband's appearance that interrupts the possibly erotic scene as well as its memory in the present. Faced with what the poem later calls this blood-loving bat, the antagonist, Plath's speaker hides behind heterosexuality, much like many of Sappho's translators and editors had prior to the 20th century. And even in the year before Plath's poem, in the book Imitations, Robert Lowell, Plath's erstwhile teacher, had managed to center or narrativize his selection of Sappho poems onto a man in 1961. So, filled up with hate up to my neck, Plath's speaker does not speak. And in this symptom, she resembles Sappho's speaker, who, of course, whose tongue is famously broken. And she prepares to leave. Even in your Zen heaven we shan't meet is the poem's final line in a stanza all of its own, and I'll talk about what happens in between in a minute. Infusing what could have been construed as a Sappho separation poem with a negative emotion leading to a memory that soothes without undoing the pain of separation, it infuses this separation poem with the animus of fragment 55. Oops. Here you go. Where Sappho condemns her rival to being forgotten, specifically unseen in the house of Hades, just as here, this kitchen is hell, they're not seeing each other, and the two women shan't meet in heaven either. Perhaps cognizant of this, the last we hear from the antagonist is her exasperation at women too, and her resignation to the idea that she can't communicate. Sorry, these lines are out of order. Indeed, the fear expressed by the poem's last few lines here on the right-hand side is that something like a sapphic comfort or feminism might be deceitful. The neighbor's cute decor is no less entrapping than the fist of a baby. The sea anemone that follows is named for its resemblance to the land anemone. That's a flower that opens when the wind blows. But the sea anemone is similarly not a pretty flower at all, but it's a predatory, stinging marine animal. Like the decor and the baby, like a lesbian alliance or 1950s domesticity, like a sapphic tradition shaped primarily by men or by the reactive fantasies of women, the anemone is a kleptomaniac. And note here the return of that final word from the Longinus passage. It takes rather than adds. It doesn't give beauty, meaning, relevance. It just takes and takes. Plath's Lesbos is thus an anti-Lesbos. It implicitly negates a whole female and male tradition of engagement with Sappho without ever mentioning Sappho's name or alluding to her work explicitly beyond the on-the-surface inexplicable choice of Lesbos as the title. Though again, as I've done here, one could spot echoes of fragment as well as the Longinus description, but it's not clearly there for the taking. We might say that these weak links, the absence of Sappho, is the point of the poem. She has already been erased, her relevance rejected. To go back to the beginning for a second, the kittens, right, mini Sapphos, kittens of the cat, are left dying outside the kitchen, and the daughter, her mind divided, but schizophrenic, the daughter so frequently a symbol of the next generation or of a future society in Sapphic writings, the daughter can't hear them. There is no future. Sappho is erased because the binary she's seen as defining between a utopian but somewhat doomed lesbian community or nude domesticity is one that offers only bad choices as far as this female poet is concerned. That said, it is perhaps because Plath has exercised in Lesbos all of the caricatures of Sappho she has inherited that she finally wants to properly read her and asks Clarissa Roche for the book. Plath's relationship to Sappho is antagonistic, as she treats this first female lyric poet and the tradition that she inaugurates with hostility and suspicion. Adrienne Rich's negation of Sappho could be said to take a more reparative form. And I'm here thinking of Melissa Muller's recent arguments about Sappho's own reparative relation to Homer. Rich enters Sappho's material and textual space and writes beside her, even while keeping her distance. As Heather Love puts it, Fareed Kosofsky-Sedgwick, who first articulated this opposition between the so-called paranoid and reparative reading, reparation is on the side of multiplicity, surprise, rich divergence, and this is where the rich poem, pun unintended, this is where the rich poem will make its home in divergence, consolation, creativity, and love. As for Plath, for rich too, Sappho stems in the beginning of a female poetic tradition. And again, a quote, I read the older women poets with their peculiar keenness and ambivalence, Sappho, Christina Rossetti, Emily Dickinson. This is Rich, Adrienne Rich, writing in 1971 in her landmark essay, When We Dead Awaken, writing as revision. But writing in 1971, she's now able to see that she read these women poets, quote, looking in them for the same things I had found in the poetry of men, end quote. Later, Rich would evoke what she called the celebrated lesbians of the women's school around Sappho of the 7th century BC as a paradigm for female communities that can be found around the world and across time, and also claimed Sappho's fragments as evidence for what she called earlier women-affirming cultures. For Rich, the politically active lesbian feminist who left her own stifling domestic situation in 1970, Sappho may be more useful as a symbol than as a text. Because as a text, after all, she's been worked over and in a real sense produced by men's labor and prejudices. And so despite her scattered references to myth and her thematization of her own project as a revision of myths, and especially myths about gender, a vision of her own project as a coming to terms with and going beyond what she called the book of myths in which our names do not appear. And despite her status as the preeminent modern poet of lesbian love, Rich, in her long career, much longer than Plath's, also seems to mostly sidestep Sappho beyond those references that I just mentioned. As in Plath, Sappho explicitly emerges in Rich's poetic work late, a few years before her death, and as it were, under erasure. Hubble Photographs After Sappho appears in her 2007 collection, Telephone Ringing the Labyrinth. This volume, her penultimate collection, by the way. This volume is very retrospective. What kind of map for the future can the past provide? With Rich herself now representing the past. What kind of map can the past provide both on the societal and the poetic level is the question that the poems in this volume keep asking. Unlike Lesbos, where Plath's intertext is the entirety of the Sapphic tradition and its reception, rather than any specific primary text, Hubble Photographs is an imitation of Sappho fragment 16, and in fact, Rich points us to the lobe where she found it. This is Carson's translation. I liked the fact that she's actually put the stanzas. It makes it easier to see with Rich. In this poem, as you probably know, Sappho affirms the priority of whatever one loves, of who you love, staking her own poetic but also ethical and moral claim in the Homeric terrain of battles and armies, and asserting her preference for women's feet over soldiers. Unlike in Plath, Sappho's name does appear in Rich's poem, indeed in the prominent place of the title, with the ambiguous after. Is Sappho superseded, fervently pursued, or simply prior? The poem itself seems to point towards the first option, apparently enacting the rejection of Sappho even while using Sappho's form. Sappho's focus on the personal, on the human, on what you love is occlusive, Rich's poem seems to argue, and thus is occluded by Rich in turn. As in a Sapphic fragment, perhaps, the title conjoins two apparently unrelated, even contradictory things. Most advanced science, represented by the Hubble telescope, which was launched in 1990 and which captures images that are fairly famous, images like these, high-resolution images of deep space that help us understand the formation and evolution of stars and galaxies. So Hubble, and on the one hand, and close to the most ancient lyric poetry on the other hand, after Sappho. And as it may have been striking to hear in 600 BC that somebody might proclaim most beautiful whatever they love, rather than golden chariots or armies, so it is to learn that Adrienne Rich, or her speaker, prefers Hubble to Sappho. It should be the most desired side of all, the person with whom we hope to live and die. Should be, yet I say there's something more desirable, the ecstasies of galaxies, so out from us, there's no vocabulary. While roughly keeping to Sappho's rhetorical device of the preamble, Rich, the quintessential 20th century poet of lesbian love, seems to put love and Sappho in their place. Where Sappho begins with black earth, Rich evokes space. And where the counterintuitive preference in Sappho was that for the beloved, for Rich, it's that for the beyond. Beyond this love which stirs the air every time she walks into the room. As Sappho acknowledges the beauty of the rejected things through her description and by returning to them, so Rich isn't entirely dismissive of the beloved and indeed follows Sappho's cyclical structure where the item dismissed in the beginning nonetheless returns and is dismissed again at the end. Right, the final bit of the fragment that we have that can be read. But the terms are flipped. Like Sappho, Rich emphasizes the beloved's step or walk, but here she's twice walking into a room rather than out of it. And she's turning to look at you rather than forgetting to, like Helen and possibly Anactoria. The beloved here is instead circumscribed, characterized by more of a permanence, hope to live and die. The beloved is there. Moreover, the violent language that Rich uses to describe the Hubble images, which you see here, subtly points back to the military themes rejected in the Sappho fragment. Rich works with or beside Sappho, though, rather than against her, offering a slanted but ultimately reparative perspective on her poem, is what I would like to argue. Rich seems to begin from Sappho's ending point. Right? What is here debated is not the most beautiful, but what is the most desired. That is, Rich grants that the most beautiful is what you desire or love, but seeks to determine whether there is something that is most desirable. And in this poem, what is most desirable is the outside of desire, the ecstasies of galaxies. So out from us, there's no vocabulary. Rich reframed Sappho's poem as being about the importance of distance, of keeping one's distance. The most beautiful is what you love when it's moving away. Helen, after all, has to follow Paris. She herself perhaps is most beautiful because she left her excellent husband, and Anactoria is most beautiful because she has left the poem's speaker. In Rich, the judgment about beauty or desirability is explicitly dependent on the lack of reciprocity, on something like indifference. Moreover, Rich here seems to prefer this ecstasis, this being outside of human relationships, not in order to personally avoid the pain involved, but in order to avoid what seems like the unavoidable inflicting of pain on the other. They don't look back like Helen, who forgot her parents and child, and we cannot hurt them. It's the poem's last line. Indeed, the poem has already enacted the difficulty of this proposition. For in the description of these impersonal photographs, space has already been inadvertently hurt through the chosen vocabulary of the speaker, right? We have sight piercing, liberations become lacerations, galaxies are exposed, they're ambiguously livid. The appeal of this space is that it's beyond, but we don't even know how to talk about it without bringing it literally within, without walking into its room, even as we fear or imagine it will come into ours, that it will invade us. The beyond here is conceived in terms of the body. There's cavity, there are veins, lacerations. That is, outer space becomes inner because that is the vocabulary that we have. The use of galaxies early in the poem was already hinting at this, and the poem makes it explicit at the end when it refers to the milky gauze about tilted gazing. That is, in the 2000s, we may no longer be mindlessly filling our skies with what Rich called in an earlier poem, a woman in the shape of a monster in the shape of a woman. But this more desirable scientific appreciation is impossible, is also a myth. For the body and bodily substances will always enwrap, will always nurture, but also enwrap and mummify what we are gazing at. Still, contemplating this scientific understanding allowed by the photograph as a modern myth, perhaps as a kind of equivalent of the Helen example in Sappho's poem, could nonetheless lead us to some kind of ethical principle, how not to hurt, or in a more pessimistic vein, to the comforting insight that despite the degree of global destruction brought about by humans, we cannot hurt them. At the same time, though, rather than surpass or overcome Sappho, the light writing of the Hubble photograph informs us of something going on, far away in space and time, also brings us back to Sappho, to her own barely visible, decipherable writing, which is also so old and so new, with this right-hand side, and to which we are not, and which tells us of a different kind of past, of a different kind of origin. Sappho speakers, too, are a species of impersonae. They provide an outside, which we can strive to see on its own terms, letting sight pierce through time, through linguistics equations, this means that, even if in the end we will transform it to a modern equivalent. We may look at Sappho's poems, but they don't look back. which own touch, whether violent or light, cannot hurt them. And that too is perhaps the comfort to the aging rich, that the past in some basic sense remains, has unalterably happened. Thus, the witch's name, that of a woman-loving female poet, does appear in the Sapphic Book of Myths. She still wants to write beyond it, reaching toward a spatially and temporally transcendent planetary consciousness. Of course, as in Sappho, the terms remain entwined. The chariots and armies aren't the most beautiful thing, but following what you love, as Helen did, can also bring them about. Similarly, the account of the ecstasies of galaxies is not immune to human passions. Our vocabulary cannot but describe it in bodily terms, or military terms, or even Sapphic forms. But the poem does offer a switch in perspective, where human relations and even the hard-fought-for open lesbian relationships are put in a planetary perspective of indifference. In writing after Sappho and substituting Hubble's name for hers, Rich is also writing after herself, making space for going beyond the personal and towards a different kind of writing that answers different ethical imperatives, which Rich herself, after a few years, will not be able to look back at. She's writing after the understanding of lyric undertaken under Sappho's, the name of Sappho by women poets, including to some extent Rich herself, and reaching beyond it to a future and to a past that she wants to maintain as untouched, unhurt, purely other. And I move to my final example. It will be a bit briefer than the other two. If Rich, writing beside Sappho, gleans from her an impossible ethical imperative of keeping one's distance, of letting ancient poems, stars, galaxies be, Harryette Mullen's work is all about bringing disparate things very close together. And I imagine that Mullen is the least well-known to you, and this is a sample of some of her work. The middle one, 2024, is a collection that's just come out by Edinburgh University Press that features a selection from throughout her career, plus critical essays, including by Emily Greenwood. So I would highly recommend that if you find what I'm about to present at all interesting. In Muse and Drudge from 1995, Mullen, a major contemporary experimental Black poet who teaches at UCLA in California, produces a long poem formed by words drawn from a wide variety of sources, intentionally mixed and broad-ranging enough to demand, per Mullen's own statement, a community of readers with different frames of references to make sense of it. Sappho is just one of the constituent voices with, for example, it's just a couple of examples from fragment 111 on the high roof, raise the roof, you carpenter men, echoing in the Mullen bit, or fragment 105, again, the apple on the left unpicked on the tree is also refracted into Mullen's poem, the peaches, or some left on the tree. Again, not quite an insertion, but kind of play with this with a Sapphic motif. But Sappho is also, in some sense, half of the book's, beyond these fragments, half of the book's protagonist. The putative muse of Muse and Drudge, famously Antiquity's 10th muse, and a name hidden in the figure of Sapphire, defined by Mullen, appropriating in that moment what was essentially a slur, defined by Mullen as an iconic Black woman who refuses to be silenced. And the Sappho Sapphire is evoked in the book's first poem, as we'll soon see. The figures of Muse and Drudge and of Sappho and Sapphire are used to probe the construction of femininity, and especially Black femininity, as well as of lyric. Much like Plath's Lesbos, Mullen's poem seems to operate within a gender binary system that it, however, more explicitly seeks to overcome. The binary between the female muse as a spiritual presence versus the drudge, who is very physical, as Mullen says, very material and embodied, as opposed to idealized or disembodied. The figure of Sappho encapsulates many of the poem's concerns. First, the desire to foreground the female voice. Sappho is paradigmatic in that respect, in that, as Mullen writes, ancient poetry is a place where a woman is actually one of the forerunners and foremost practitioners of the art, end quote. Second, though, the elevation of the female poet or artist to the status of muse also in some ways robs her of her agency and splits her from her body, as I was just talking about. Indeed, we might recall Sappho's own split reputation in ancient and medieval sources, where she's doubled as Sappho the poet and Sappho the lascivious woman, the courtesan, and so on. Third, the rapprochement between the lyric tradition and the avant-garde. Mullen is interested in the figuration of a speaking eye, but wants to multiply it and to interrogate it as an effect of language. Sappho is in some ways the perfect vehicle for this, not only because the intimate nature of her songs make belie their communal or public performances, but also because so many others have performed Sappho's songs, have rewritten them, translated them. Finally, Mullen is interested in demonstrating the materiality as opposed to the transparency of the spoken and written word, which again makes Sappho an excellent paradigm given the difficulties in getting beyond the material on which her work is preserved. And Mullen consistently draws attention to such materiality by referring to sarcophagi and fragments and hieroglyphs and so on. Mullen is much more problematic about her negations, occlusions, and absences than either Plath or Rich, and that program extends well beyond Sappho or any classical reference. As Charlotte Higgins puts it, her poetry is characterized by, quote, a process of disavowal in language, a type of periphrasis where the most significant term of a text is withheld, unquote. Though our text is complete, Mullen's poem is complete, it's so all open formally, without titles, sections, with no punctuation, that it invites its own construction in any number of ways. The first page poem in this book, each page has 4 stanzas. Are they a poem? Are they a page? It's something else for the reader to construct. But the very first poem, in Muse and Drudge, reads like a mashup of fragments 31, 105, as we saw in 55, combined with a variety of Sapphic stereotypes. This is the highest density of Sappho that we get in the book, as would befit a kind of proem. It evokes the lyrical prowess of the Sappho sapphire, as well as her association with the body. You have the punning in the beginning between the lyre and the styles and the stylus, which we had in the poster image of Sappho for this talk. The last line zooms in on the more human figure. The middle lines are kind of vertically split between human features, parts of bodies, and then also musical references, but also make sense as wholes, as syntactic wholes. The next stanza is similarly split between contrasts. The first line, again, evoking the paradoxical singing of fragment 31, right? My last note of lucid music, the tongue breaks, before turning to 105, which we saw before. Slowly, the poem begins to show the kind of consequences of this split perception of Sappho. Don't mess with me, I'm evil, I'm in your sin. And then finally, the final stanza could represent Sappho's response, or Sappho's response to these accusations. Borrowing from Diane Rayer's rendering of fragment 55, which we've already seen before in a different translation, the speaker here condemns her rivals to memoryless death. At the same time, given the mobility of the speaking voice in the poem, we might think of this as a comment on the fate of Sappho herself. Her wings clipped, her moon no longer outshining all the other stars. There is no memory of her, no memory of you, a living being with drives and desires. And yet she still flutters, though invisible, caught in precisely that contradiction. Flutter provides the link to the quatrains on the following page and takes us to the darker parts of Mullen's narrative. And I'm just going to show you this and then conclude. My heart flutters in my breast, reads Rayer's translation of fragment 31, of that line from fragment 31, which becomes here, your heart beats me as I lie naked on the grass. Mullen's formulation suggests both the degree of possession by the beloved that Sappho feels, as if her heart beats to the rhythm of the other, or that we might feel when reading Sappho, as if the beats of her heart are our own, but also clearly hints at abuse, once again drawing the thin line between Muse and Drudge. The end of the poem emphasizes this vulnerability by turning to some man and meditating on his kind, while also suggesting how we might read her Sapphic echoes. Detecting the Sapphic signal is erotic, but also bittersweet. Emitting the signal seems in this poem to be almost coerced and certainly dangerous. In the end, leaving the I voice dependent on the kind of, inevitably, the man, or the master narrative that picks it up. Speaking of Muse and Drudge, Mullen claims that the fragments, however they're arranged, don't add up to a master narrative that could easily be said of Sappho herself, as well as of the flutterings of Sappho in Mullen's book. The Greek poet is never named, but only synecdochically and not necessarily implied, as in all of the examples that I've shown you. Rayer's translation of Sappho is so refracted by Mullen's synthesis that we only see Sappho if you carry her inside your soul, to paraphrase what Kalafi says about the Cyclops, as, for example, I do. All of these lines, other readers have found all sorts of other references to which, I mean, maybe you are finding more, to which I'm not privy to. Sappho is one name that can carry the tensions Mullen is interested in limiting, but infinite semantic slides are acceptable, just as muse and drudge slides into mule and drug, or mutant taint of blood. To draw then towards a conclusion, we have seen that Plath antagonizes and refuses or rejects the Sapphic tradition. She's exemplary of a paranoid reading of both Lesbos and of her speaker's interlocutor, positing paranoia as the defining relationship between women whose minds are split, schizophrenic from childhood on. Rich, while writing under the guise of refuting Sappho, some say, I say, in fact, usefully probes and extends some of her terms, both readying the fragment for a different kind of future and seeking to preserve it as a pure, indifferent other. Mullen is in some ways, and surprisingly so, less resistant to Sappho than either Plath or Rich. She's more willing to accept Sappho as a forebear, indeed to claim her, as she comes through in Rayer's translation, as a voice for Black writing. While giving her some symbolic value then, Mullen also abstracts her and submerges her in what she calls the recyclopedia. For Mullen, Sappho isn't a particularly privileged signifier, just part of the detritus that the poet collects and reuses. Sappho thus emerges in another one of the volume's puns, both mute and dubbed. The absence of community that Plath implicitly laments, the future community that Rich intentionally keeps herself from envisioning, Mullen actually brings into being through the very texture of her book. The poem ends by more definitively embracing my body's Southern song, and from this sense of liberation, it urges all addressees to proceed with abandon, to find where you are and who you're playing for, what stray companion. Recalling Sappho's fragment 160, Mullen also opens it up. The circle of the companions isn't delimited by a personal pronoun, but explicitly stray and potentially straying. That is, it is fundamental to the project that any connections, classical or other, remain tenuous. Thank you very much.